Tim McGuire here with Boxing Bants Ireland, and I'm very, very happy to be here, joined by author of Damage, the untold story of brain trauma and boxing, Mr. Tris Dixon. Tris, I followed your work for quite a long time in regards to read your book, the Road to Nowhere. I found that it's almost like a sequel to the Damage. Damage is almost like a sequel to that, but yeah, and of course, Boxing Life Stories over the last 3, 4 years of my life has been a big part of it. I've really enjoyed it. So, yeah, really appreciate you coming on and giving me your time.
That's great. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I was obviously it's nice to talk. I always like talking about the Road to Nowhere because it brings back very nice nostalgic memories of 20 years ago, actually, when I moved out to America to try and make it as a fighter and failed, but ended up obviously living a very sort of odd and nomadic existence, trying to track down old fighters who'd vanished from the face of the earth from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and actually some who really have gone on to become lifelong friends.
Yeah, and there is part in the book that kind of it seems like almost like the roots of that led you to Damage, and whether that was purposely or unpurposely, but yeah. Well, first thing I want to say is Cte Awareness Month from Concussion Legacy Foundation. I know you've spoken to them in your book with neurologists that are working in there, but the first thing I want to basically speak about at the very start is I know you're not trying to discredit the sport in a way, that you are someone who is very much a lover of the sport of boxing, and you're not one of these people that are trying to, left-wing woke people who are trying to bastardize the sport in that sense. This is very much trying to help the sport.
Yeah, 100%. That was probably my main concern with writing it as well, to be honest, really, to give the guys who want the sport abolished ammunition, which I think, in so many ways, it's not done that. And obviously, I think, I've cited him a couple of times, but Matt Dickinson, who's the chief sports writer for the Times, read the book. And I was concerned when the publishers were saying, oh, we're going to send him a review copy because he's asked for one. I was concerned what we were going to get. And in fact, Matt did a very even-handed review of the book and said, it does acknowledge the sport's shortcomings, but it does also give solutions and answers as to what the sport can do to help these guys during and after their careers. And I think that's, that is a key thing. And, obviously I'm a boxing guy. I'm passionate for the sport. It's given me some wonderful memories over the last 2.5 decades, as we sort of mentioned at the top there. And yeah, that was the last thing I wanted. And sometimes I get the occasional message on social media from people who've clearly not read the book saying, oh, you're going to get the sport banned and all the rest of it. I think I touched upon this with Matt Christie the other day in a podcast, the boxing news editor in Boxing Life Stories. We've basically just had the 2028 Olympics taken away from us, right? Boxing as a sport, because our house isn't in order. We have the opportunity in professional boxing to get ahead of the curve, to sort of try and almost nip this stuff in the bud. And there's so much we can do. Do you know what? And obviously, I'm talking about obviously a centralized organization where people can share brain scans nationwide. So you can't be banned from boxing in the UK because you've got because there's been an abnormality on your brain scan, but you go and fight in Latvia, or you can't get banned, or you get banned in California, so you go and fight in New York and so forth. All that stuff. Then there's obviously sparring protocols and all this, and people say, oh, one of the things that drives me crackers, we all know getting hit in the head's not good for you. I'm not being, that's bollocks. That doesn't wash with me any longer. People don't know what's being done. People still think it's a lottery. People still think, oh, I'm going to be one of the lucky ones, without knowing that, that a cumulative effect of damage to the brain affects everybody across the board. And everyone's got different amounts, where you can take. And clearly, if you've had 300 amateur fights and then boxed as a pro for 10 or 15 years, chances are when you've been retired 10 or 15 years, that it will come back to bite you in some way, shape or form. And, you know, I just hear so much stuff, you know, so much naivety about brain trauma in boxing. Even to this day, I spoke with one of the country's top coaches yesterday, and he was telling me a story where he'd sent one of his fighters to spar somewhere, and his fighter was dropped and hurt. And the guy that he'd gone with phoned the guy's head coach and said, oh, he's been dropped, you know, and he's quite badly shaken up. And the guy said, well, pull him out and get him home. And he said, well, are you sure? Because it's only been 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Guy should be like not going near boxing ring for another couple of months. And even then he's got to get checked out and go and see the doctor and check himself for concussion and all the rest of it. Because one of the main things is when we talk about this, you know, and this isn't me being, like you say, left wing and woke and all the rest of it. There's something called second impact syndrome, which is a big thing where, you know, oh, that's my French bulldog there. There's you know, the first, so for example, that damage that might have been caused in that sparring session, the first one might have caused all the kinds of, it would have been like an earthquake perhaps in the brain, but the structures and foundations remained intact. However, if the guy then got back up and started boxing, maybe a soft jab would have been like the aftershock that just comes and wipes everything out. And I think we've seen this a few times in boxing. I'm loath to sort of give specific examples, but I think we've seen it. And this is why these guys need looking after, particularly if they're damaged in sparring and they've either got a fight coming up or they've got another day's sparring or whatever. Just get them out of there. And then, you know, being concussed is only going to affect your performance anyway. You're only going to be flat. You're not going to be what you want to be. You'll probably end up taking more damage, and you'll be angry at yourself for the sparring that you should, because you're not going to be firing all cylinders. Obviously, who is when they're all hazy and their heads in the cloud from a concussion? And I think obviously people are slow to diagnose concussions. They're slow to accept concussions. You know, concussions are a serious thing. Like, and you'll know if you're concussed. You know, like, obviously there are symptoms if you feel sick or if you start having short-term memory issues and so forth. But you know, you'll know if you've taken a real big bang on the head, and if the pain doesn't go away, chances are you shouldn't still be in there boxing. And forget being, and this is, I suppose, where the book's coming in. Sometimes you've got to forget being a man's man. Because in your own interests, and obviously your own interests, the sake of your family, so your wife, your girlfriend, your parents, your kids, they're the ones that are going to be looking after you long term. So maybe put someone else first and not your stupid pride and bravery, because there's more to life than boxing. And so many people have found that out the hard way by putting all their eggs in the boxing basket. And when they retire at 35, they got nothing. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's, you know, hey, yes, it's great to have that sort of myopic look at the sport where, you know, you're so committed and dedicated, but it doesn't need to be like that. You know, people have it twisted about how dedicated you need to be with boxing, and people have it wrong. And I see it all the time, you know, even, you know, I know we're in February now, but I remember at Christmas time, every Christmas we see people, you know, training through Christmas and say, oh yeah, I'm so committed, I'm so dedicated. I mean, I'm not being funny, but it's only a couple of hours a day to go out and train. Most of the people in the sport that I do go out and train on Christmas Day and Boxing Day anyway. So, like, it's no biggie. It's no huge sacrifice. And also people then talking about, oh, missing Christmas dinner and, you know, not having anything sweet. You could do that as long as you're recording your macros and counting your calories and being sensible. But boxing is a sport in the dark ages where people have this thing where they think they're being hard by continuing and sparring when they shouldn't be sparring. They think they're being hard by, you know, by denying themselves a Christmas dinner when it's only a roast turkey and a bit of veg anyway. They think they're being hard by training on Christmas Day, and it's, you know, that's normal life. But obviously, I suppose what I'm getting at is there's numerous things in the sports culture that's just so old school, and this thing about you know, there's so little that can be done when a brain is damaged that you've got to protect it as best as you can. And what comes, you know, we all always hear that well-worn phrase, as long as you've got your health, or your health comes first. Well, that's paramount. That's paramount. And people, you know, you can't take it for granted in our sport that you're always going to have it. So you need to cherish it and look after it and protect it as best as you can.
Mm-hmm. I think what your book is getting at is the CTE, which of course you'll explain in a minute. But when boxers start off, I think a lot of them will say, "Well, I'm prepared for the worst case scenario. I know what that is," and a lot of them to them is getting stretchered out in the ring, potentially dying in the ring, or Jerry McClellan, people like that. But there's something much more darker than that. And you said how a lot of boxers put their eggs in the same basket, and to me, it's not even putting your eggs into a basket. It's dropping your eggs from 5 foot into a basket and then holding the basket and trying to walk across the beam and hoping that you get to the other end unscathed. And I don't think people realize that as a prospect, even as a prospect or whatever side or however far in your career you are, that the medical board could just turn around to you and you could be 20-0 and just go, "Oh yeah, by the way, the chemistry in your brain has changed, so we're not passing anymore." You're not, And I don't think they realize the brain, how complicated it is. But is that something that you find with boxers? They think the worst case scenario is, I don't know, getting knocked out, death in the ring, rather than thinking about the long-term effects of CTE.
100%. And, there's still a lot of people, obviously on my podcast, sometimes I'll ask people what CTE is. And more often than not, people won't know. Fighters, current active fighters or recently retired fighters, don't know what it is and they've never heard of it. So, it's all very well people saying, "Oh, we know the risks." But if you don't know what CTE is, how can you say you know what the risks are? Because you don't know what arguably the main risk is. And it drives me crackers. And it goes to that earlier thing where people say, "Oh, we know getting hit in the head isn't good for you." But, people don't understand that. And that is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I was the editor of Boxing News. And obviously I was in boxing for 20 odd years before I knew about this. I only read it. I only knew of the link once I read the book, The League of Denial, which was about the concussion crisis in the NFL, and I started to draw the parallels. And then obviously I started to realize that CTE was originally what was called punch drunk syndrome. And then I was like, well, it's not just boxing's problem. It is literally our problem. It came from us. This was first coined in the medical lexicon in 1928 in Dr. Harrison Martland's punch drunk paper. And, and American football's almost to a degree taken ownership of it, so to speak. But people in boxing still don't know what it is. And, perfect example, and I think he wouldn't mind admitting it. I wrote a piece on Irish Mickey Ward a few years ago, like 2 or 3 years ago, I think. And it was around the time that I was interviewing him for Damage. And it went in Boxing News. And I remember Carl Frampton writing about it in his column in the Belfast Telegraph, saying, it's the first time I've thought about the long-term risks and the long-term dangers of boxing. This is a guy who'd already been, at least a world champion once by then, if not a couple of times. And he didn't know about the risks and the dangers long-term. He hadn't given it a second thought. No one had told Carl about it. And now actually Carl is in the middle of Damage at the minute, and he's
I saw that yesterday. Yeah,
and putting them up on his Instagram.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to say to oh, so and so doesn't know about CTE, so because then it just looks like I'm trying to drop people in it. But people don't, and I'm just trying to think. People like I've recently been working with Donovan Curry, who's Don Curry's son, and he said, his dad had no idea what CTE was. And I know, obviously, we're talking about a fighter who was around in the 80s. But we've obviously got fighters who are active now and who've been boxing in the 2020s. And they don't know what CTE is either. And it's terrifying because it's such a big issue. And it's such, it's so hard. I'm writing a book now about Matthew Saad Muhammad, a light heavyweight in the late 70s and early 80s. And I was fortunate to have interviewed a lot of his contemporaries 20 years ago. But now, 20 years down the line, those same guys that could speak to me brilliantly 20 years ago, when they were sort of 20 years off, 15 years after their career, it's very hard for me to have a conversation with any of them. There's certainly no point in me doing podcasts with any of them because, they're quiet, mumbled, slurring, short-term memory, loads of issues. And it's tragic, but this is the cycle. And, when I started on the road to nowhere, doing those interviews with the guys from the 50s and 60s, and I didn't know what CTE was. A lot of those guys were symptomatic. One of them, Gene Fulmer, his wife was trying to convince me that he had Alzheimer's and it was nothing to do with boxing. Another guy, 𝐬𝐶𝐬 𝐬, when he went to meet me in Connecticut, couldn't find his car where he parked afterwards. And, it was quite a distressing moment in the book then. Rocky Castellani had to go through the interview with his wife, Mary, because he couldn't remember details about his career.
Or Floyd Patterson in the court.
Yeah, so with hindsight, they were all examples of guys with CTE, but I didn't know, then what I know now.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, it's just such a big topic, and people just aren't educated. And it won't take much for places like the Border Control to start to raise awareness about it and to do more about it. And I think because the board in this country is one of the best in the world.
Yeah.
I think they're almost, I don't want to say they're content to do what they're doing, but they maybe feel that they don't have the need to really, really push and take it to the next level. But, there's no reason why anyone in the sport should be complacent. We all want to be striving to improve it and make the environment and culture better for our fighters. Because without the fighters, we've got no sport. And without the fighters being able to deliver their best every time, we won't get a fair reflection of what our sport can do and what our sport can offer. So it's a tough one in that respect, but there is a lot that can be done.
We've said the word CTE quite a bit, but it's just to explain to people that don't understand what it is and what's actually happening in the brain when it's happening. I know it's basically a form of a protein forming in the brain, but if you want to explain to people what exactly it is.
Yeah, sure. So we're talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is, like you said, there's a form of protein in the brain called tau protein, which is a toxic protein which basically starts killing brain cells, and it starts blocking the function of the brain cells. And obviously, depending on where the trauma's been, there's different areas of the brain that affect different behaviors and different abilities. So there's obviously parts of the brain that affect emotions. So obviously when you talk about some of the guys that have committed suicide, or they've made bizarre decisions in their life, or they've suffered from depression, and their decision making's been affected, then obviously that's one side. But then you've also got the motor side of things, where speech can be affected. You can walk, it can change the gait of how you walk and that kind of thing as well. So there's those two things. And the problem is, at the moment, you can only diagnose CTE at death, and that's with an autopsy, when you scan the brain and you can see the tau protein through a microscope, which is something I did obviously for damage when I went to the brain bank at BU and at Boston University. And but you can't see it for now during any kind of scans. And obviously that's one of the main things that the studies that are being done currently around the world are trying to see, so that you can try and detect this tau protein through different scans and different devices while these guys are alive, so that it's not left. Because the problem is, a lot of these studies now are bias studies, because people are leaving their brains behind because they're affected and they know they're affected. So obviously what you need to do is have guys that have had a moderate exposure to trauma or no exposure to trauma to start leaving their brains behind, so that you can see differences. But yeah, so it's a huge thing. Obviously, you mentioned CTE. It's sort of become part of the modern day lexicon, courtesy of the Will Smith concussion movie, and with everything that's now going on in American football, with soccer here in the UK, and with rugby union, with the class action lawsuit that's being brought against the authorities in rugby as well. So it's a huge topic. And I suppose one thing I just want to say it now is, this isn't, by the way, something where I've tried to jump on any kind of bandwagon as well in that respect. Obviously, I'm a boxing guy, so my thing is about how I relate it to my sport, rather than me saying, oh, football's in. I mean, obviously, I started researching damage long before, or, there weren't many cases, maybe the Jeff Aspinall one, possibly, when I started writing damage. But obviously, I suppose just in terms of context, actually, I was thinking about writing a book about life after boxing and struggles after boxing for quite a while. I've been thinking of that for maybe the best part of 10 years, in way, shape, or form. And then obviously when I read this League of Denial, I started to read about how the exposure to trauma can affect so many fighters. Then obviously it seemed to work hand in hand. The fact that, you know, no one's talking about this, no one's doing anything about it, the education is basically non-existent, and people in the gyms and trainers don't know about it. They really don't. And you know, people across the board in the sport don't know about it, and they don't know what they're dealing with, and it's terrifying. And I've heard from some high level people in the sport saying, "Oh, we don't want to read damage because it might change the way that we look at the sport." And I'm thinking, well, you know, you guys are in a position of power. You can make decisions whether you're looking after these people or not looking after these people, but you choose not to because you don't want to affect how you see the sport. I think the best thing is read the book, and then use it as a guide. You know, the amount of people in the sport, whether it's neurologists, managers, obviously journalists, you know, people have said by the dozen about the book. You know, everyone in sports should read it. And that's not me as a sales point trying to say that. It's me trying to say, you know, this is an instruction manual as to how you can best look after your fighters.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? It's funny you say that, because when most of the interviews I would do is on the island of Ireland, and I have, in the last few months that I've been reading the book, I have mentioned it to pretty much everyone that I've been interviewing. Either some of them have had fights coming up, some of them very big names in this country, and some of them not so big names. And I've said to them, and a lot of them have said what you've said. They've said, "Oh, well, I don't know if I want to read it now because it's got a fight coming up and it might affect my mindset," or even just people around them. You know, I have had a couple of coaches who are open, who have said, "Oh yeah, I would like to read it," but then there's others who haven't, top level ones. But it's sad when you think about it, because I remember Margaret Goodman said brilliantly. She said, you know, through all of this decisions you make in boxing, at the end of the day, we all think, boxers think, well, it's on me. I'm taking the risk, so I'll live with the consequences. But ultimately, your family are going to be people looking after you. It's not going to be your coach. It's not going to be anyone else. Your family are going to have to look after you, and whether it's death, health, whatever it is after boxing, it's going to be on you, no one else. And
you've got to think it should be a long period of time. You know, a lot of these guys are out of the sport by 35. You know, you've still got well over, hopefully, half of your life ahead of you. You've got the majority of your life ahead of you.
Yeah. And
you're looking at a small window of time here where you've got to get in and get what you can and get out.
Mm-hmm. The first study was done by Martin in 1928, and one thing that resonated with me in it was, a lot of the time now we see in boxing, and like you say, it's the macho sport. It's somewhere where you can't quit. You can't. You have to basically die on your shield to be respected. And a lot of posts that you see in boxing now is pictures of like the longest boxing fight in history, two men standing there covered in blood, who fought. I can't remember how many rounds it was. I think it was in your book. It was 100. It was easy, like 117 rounds. Back then, there was no limit to knockdowns. There was no limit to the amount of rounds you did. And people in this study either end up dying very, very young, or were in mental institutions in their 30s, which people don't realize. And that's why rules and commissions came into it. But was it scary for you looking back at those studies back then and realizing how much the sport has come on?
Well, you know, I tell you what's scarier is realizing how much things are still the same. You know, when I've just interviewed Gary Sykes for the podcast during the last few months, and Gary Sykes, one of those guys who'd never heard about CTE. I sent him a copy of the book afterwards, but if you can hear, it's quite a distressing interview.
I heard it. Yeah.
And this is a guy who's been locked up in inverted commas mental institution for his own good. And you know, obviously, the book looks at Harold Graham in a psychological unit in London as well. And, you know, the same thing's still happening to these guys. These guys were called, you know, all the horrible things, you know, in inverted commas, loonies, and all the really derogatory terms of the day back in the 1920s. And yet the same thing's still happening with guys now. And the problem is as well with so many of these guys, like Gary Sykes was told he was bipolar, and I'm convinced obviously it's CTE.
Yeah.
And you know, all these guys here, you know, are given so many diagnoses when CTE is not really, it doesn't seem to be crossing through into major realms of healthcare. These guys are being told they've got Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, ALS, and all these different things. And maybe they do, and maybe they've got CTE as well, but maybe they've got just CTE. And obviously the same thing when it comes to these guys who are depressed, you know, manic depressives, suicidal, and guys that are being thrown into institutions. Don Curry's another one who keeps getting chucked into prison because he's not able to use, you know, the guidelines of society anymore. These guys are still getting chucked into institutions. So yeah, you can say the sport's evolved. Of course it has. You know, we've gone from obviously to 15 round to 12 round fights. And I think a lot of this has been done for the stuff you mentioned at the top, which is like the acute injuries that happen on fight night. You know, so your Duke Kim tragedies, your Gerald McClellan stuff, your Michael Watson issues. I still don't think there's enough set up in terms of protocols, in terms of looking after a fighter about long-term care and long-term health. And hey, one thing that I made me a lot happier, and this was only after I finished Damaged, I think, okay, leave the fights as the fights. Okay, the fights, you don't touch them. Okay, but everything away from the fights, you can sort out and change. You can reduce the amount of rounds you're sparring. You can reduce your exposure to brain trauma. You can change the quality of sparring so you're not in wars day in, day out, because all of this stuff does take a cumulative effect. When I spoke to Mickey Wardle for the book, obviously there's a stat in the book that he thinks 90% of his damage was done through sparring. Well, hey, I'm never going to be one to say, because I'm an old school guy as well, I'd never be one to say, oh, you got to get rid of sparring. But for me, there'd be a certain amount, you know, if you've got a 4-round fight, you probably don't need 100 rounds of sparring. And if you've got a 12-round fight, you probably, again, don't need 100 rounds of sparring to the head, you know, and you probably don't need 100 super intense rounds either. You're going to have to build towards it in some way, shape or form. And then maybe at the crescendo and the climax of your camp, maybe have a couple of harder spars. But you're not going to be going day in and day out. And obviously Freddie Roach, another one I spoke to in the book, talked about how he's reduced sparring from his guys from like 3 or 4 days a week to 2 days a week. And I think this is all sensible. And this is all stuff that's moving in the right direction. But, you know, obviously there's, you know, whether it's happening to the law and to the letter, I don't think it is. And obviously it's something that you can't police. But obviously, ultimately, so many of these guys and trainers and all the rest of it say they're you know, they want to look after their fighters. Well, now's the opportunity for these guys to start to learn a little bit about how best to look after these guys.
It's interesting you say about the sparring and whatnot. Like, I was one of those people from coaching football. I coached football in America for maybe about 4 or 5 years, and that was one of the first countries where it was brought in with no heading from under 14s down. So the first year that was implemented, I remember, you know, being kind of old school, almost being infuriated by it, because certain, you know, I was thinking it's part of the game, and I realized how ignorant I was at the time, because once I got into boxing, I realized that how serious it really is, brain trauma and what has the science shown you in terms of the trauma to the brain? Does it really suggest, is it more so the repetition of close to the brain rather than the amount of power and force put behind it?
It's the sort of thing that the studies are trying to sort of work out now. And obviously, you know, it's hard to tell, isn't it? It's so hard to tell, because some fighters are built differently, and some people we would say have got a good chin, and some people would say probably don't have a good chin. And so there's no real hard and fast answer to that question. I would say, you know, I suppose what you're getting at is, what's better, to take one big clean shot and get wiped out, or to take 12 rounds of someone jabbing your face off? It's just neither. Neither are optimal, are they? But I don't know. Maybe the 12 rounds would be the worst one. I mean, I don't know. Again, this is stuff that's that's all being checked out by the studies. You know, there's no sort of hard and fast thing. One thing that they did come up with, and I think it's in the book, maybe in that Boston chapter, where they sort of did say that they worked out how many hits were possible for an American footballer to take. And I think by the time that they're through the college years and then drafted into the NFL, they basically have a 3-year window to get in and get out before, you know, things can drastically take a turn for the worse. And obviously some guys have end up playing in the NFL for 20 years, but they're saying like 3 years is about the safe range.
Something very interesting as well you said in it was the word punchy gets thrown out a lot in boxing, and it wasn't until a few years ago where I saw some boxers who were retired a few years, and some of them are very, very high level boxers, have served the country very well in the Olympics and whatnot, and people are calling them punchy, like behind the back, and I'm thinking to myself, God, like that person, because the consensus a lot is punchy is someone who isn't a high level boxer. But if from reading the book, it's seeming now to suggest that the higher level you are means the more grit you have, the more accurate the punches you can throw and take, and the longer you're going to stay in, which maybe might suggest that you're going to take more damage than your typical journey.
That's certainly been an argument put forward by a couple of scientists, and obviously by Claude Abrams, who was my predecessor at Boxing News, who sort of seemed to think, you know, if you have these top guys who have great chins, enormous punching power, huge will to win, and the stakes are super high, then they're going to they'll drag each other right through the trenches for 12 rounds and take incredible abuse, and they'll be able to stand up to it. So it kind of makes sense in that respect. But obviously, at the start, the science was saying and obviously when you look at the early medical research, they were saying it's probably not going to happen to people who are very good. It's probably going to happen to journeymen or sparring partners and guys that get beat up or knocked out several times a day. And this is what was said. And I think that's probably where the stereotypes come from, all that old-fashioned, old-school stuff. Because when you talk about punchy fighters, and obviously it's a term I hate, which obviously I put in the book, you know, several times. But when you talk about that, people don't talk about 4 or 5 of the greatest of all time: Joe Louis, Willie Pep, Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Robinson, and Henry Armstrong. All 5 of them had neurological issues later in life, and they all had a load of fights and a load of sparring, and I think all of them carried on way too long. So, and then when you look at the styles of fights, well, people said Willie Pep couldn't be hit. Obviously, Ali, you know, had his rope-a-dope later on in his career, but for the longest period of time, he was known to be a hard target and hard to hit. Joe Louis got rid of a lot of his opponents early. So there's no hard and fast thing about styles. And obviously, you know, we had the famous example of George Chuvalo, where he was the guy that could take all the abuse and all the rest of it. And he lived to tell the tale, but then obviously now years down the line, he's gone into a massive steep decline, and that's been really horrendous to read as well.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Wilfred Benitez, who someone as well had a very evasive form of fighting.
They called him the Radar, El Radar, because no one could hit him.
Yeah, and he has said since, because of the damage that he thinks that he's got from boxing, that if he knew what he knew now, he wouldn't have boxed.
There've been a few people say that, but then there's also on the flip side been people who've taken the damage and say, I wouldn't change a thing. Mickey Ward for one. Aaron Pryor was another. Muhammad Ali was another. They wouldn't change the second half of their life or they wouldn't change the first half for the second half of their life. And that's their entitlement, and that's boxing. That's your choice. But arm these people with the facts so that they know what choice they're making. Because these guys said afterwards, and they didn't know the choices they were making. Yeah, with hindsight, they didn't regret it, and that's fine. They made the choices. But what I want people to have is the choice to do what they do, knowing what the consequences might be.
Yeah. So I'm just going to finish off on 2 things. So I have a boxer here from Ireland who actually gave me a quote, and it's anonymous. But this is actually something that he said to me a while ago, and I still have it. He's still active at the moment. I definitely have the early stages of something in my head, especially the last 2 years. 1 minute I'm normal, the next minute I'm zoned out of it and not knowing what's going on. It takes me a couple of minutes to come back to reality. He gets all his medicals passed. He's still allowed to fight, but he's not sure if this is something that's wrong with him. And I said I would ask you for advice to see what you think of something like that.
100%, I would go and see a neurologist. Hey, it's a really important thing that you've brought up here, really important. So I did a podcast with a retired journeyman a couple of years ago, and afterwards he said, I'd prefer you not to use it because I don't like how I sounded in that and all the rest of it. And I was like, that's fine. And he said, I've been worried about my memory, I've been worried about my speech and all the rest of it. He then went and saw a regular healthcare professional who then gave him a scan and said, no, your scan's all fine. And with all due respect to that person, to the healthcare professional, whoever it was, they don't know what they're dealing with. They don't know what they're talking about. They wouldn't have been able to compare a previous scan to this latest scan. And obviously the guy's telling you what the symptoms are. The symptoms are he's got short-term memory loss. He's speaking with a slurred speech which can be heard. So he knows what he used to sound like. He doesn't sound like that anymore. Anyway, the person then says, your brain scan's clear. Anyway, the guy then phoned me and said, oh, no, it's all right now. I'm absolutely fine. My brain scan was clear. But he's still got the short-term memory loss. Yeah. His speech is still gone. And all the issues, he still gets grinding headaches. All the issues are still there, but he got this scan saying he's all clear. He needs to go and see a neurologist, a proper neurologist, and someone who knows about CTE, and have a discussion, a full and frank discussion with them. Too many people out there aren't experts and don't know about CTE. I haven't heard. Obviously, you can't diagnose CTE until death, but obviously, when you've had an exposure to a volume of punishment, a volume of trauma, it's got to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, like
you need to have that conversation with people who know what it is. And there's no point going and seeing someone who doesn't know what CTE is and then doing a brain scan and saying, no, you're fine, just go on about your business. Because it's not fine. You need some help and you need some direction.
Last thing to say, I've got a question from, I think it's one of your patrons, 𝐬𝐞𝐬𝐬.
Yeah.
She says, has any governing body or licensing body, etc., engaged with your book post publication about what you?
No, and that's a great question from 𝐬𝐞𝐬. I think it's no. A long story short, I think the most engagement I've had has been from probably promoter Lou DiBella. A couple of ringside officials and doctors have reached out to me having read it, and I think it's probably changed some things for them personally, not in terms of whether they believe in the sport or not, but in terms of how they see things, and I think that's probably helpful. But in terms of any kind of structure, no. I think maybe one of the most interesting conversations I've had has been with Tony Jeffries, who put something up on social media a couple of weeks ago saying we need to do something. And Tony and I mean to collaborate to try and do something. Obviously, Tony's been in the book, and he's obviously been quite vocal about brain health and everything else, and he's trying to give himself the best quality of life moving forwards. And so, for the longest time, I was thinking, I've kind of done my book, I've kind of done my bit, and I've sort of left it there for people to either ignore or run with. But I actually think now that maybe I should do something, and maybe I do need to do something because no one else is doing anything. And I just, I heard this, like I said at the start, I heard these horror sparring stories yesterday from one of the top coaches in the country, and I was just like, from what I've heard, some of the time it feels like we're going backwards.
Yeah.
And so Tony and I have had some well-meaning exchanges privately. I don't quite know what we do, but there's all through social media and Tony's posts and some of the stuff I've done, we have had volunteers, whether it's people who have backgrounds in accounts wanting to help us get up and running with something, people who've got backgrounds in surveys and medical surveys as well, as to start helping ex-fighters and stuff. So no to the actual organizations reaching out to me, but yes to the possibility of us creating our own organization to try and help in some way, shape or form.
What do you think a message should be sent to boxers and to coaches from this book? I imagine mainly for coaches to be aware of the dangers and manage sparring and not turn a blind eye to it, because like you said, I found out a lot especially in this country, talking about the book to certain trainers and whatnot, and they've kind of ignored it. And it's kind of shown me who really cares about the boxers and who pretends to.
Well, that's exactly the thing. You sort of answered your own question there. If you care about your fighters, if you care about the boxers that you will probably say you care about, that you do anything for, then the very least you could do is arm yourself with the knowledge you need to best protect them. And best protect them, not just on fight night. That's not your job. Your job is to protect them 365 days a year. And if you're not doing that, then you can't claim to protect them. And, you know, and you can't claim to want to protect them if you're not arming yourself with the right knowledge that's going to look after them as best as you possibly can. It's down to these trainers. It's down to the trainers and families and anyone who says they care about the fighters to learn about what the actual risks are. And then obviously to help deal with them when it's, you know, unfortunately too late, because you know, too many of these guys are left high and dry as well.
And the message to the boxers, what would you say would be the message to them individually?
Just try and educate yourself. I mean, I would say that you guys boxing now are the ones who can help shape the culture moving forwards. You've inherited this crazy macho culture where everyone is judged against a Rocky Marciano with his nose hanging off against Ezzard Charles, or a Danny Williams with his shoulder hanging off against Mark Potter. You know, just because those are the ones that have been celebrated in the past doesn't mean that's the direction the sport needs to go moving forwards. And obviously, like I said, you know, you're a long time retired. You need to give yourself the best shout at a good quality of life after boxing. Your boxing memories, I was going to say, they'll always be there. You know, you might take it for granted. They might not be there when you're 50 or 60 years old, but you know, you want to have that best, you want to give yourself the best quality of life after boxing. I mean, just one last case study is obviously that very sad chapter on the Moya brothers, who were both had long-term issues from boxing, and they were both showing symptoms by their mid-40s. And these guys wound up spending more than half their lives in a nursing home, being looked after by their 95-year-old dad, by their siblings, by their children, and then by their grandchildren. You know, like, you know, it's, yes, you need to be selfish in this sport, but you got to be smart as well.
Yeah. The Leon Spinks one really, it got to me. Like I really I almost got upset reading it. You know, he got up early and then he rang the radio. The radio show wanted him to come on, and basically just when he put the phone in, they just mocked him. It was just really.
Well, they started to cut commercials using taking the mick out of his voice and everything else. Yeah, just horrendous. Yeah. And this is what I want to stop. You know, I want to stop this punchy terminology and the stereotypes and stuff. And boxing can, you know, we want more for our heroes, and you know, I want more for our heroes, and that's a big reason why I've done the book.
Well, look, Tris, I really, really appreciate your time. It's been fantastic, and look, I'm loving the podcast, and I enjoyed the book. And for everyone at home, read it, Damage by Tris Dixon, and of course all your other books. You've the Floyd Mayweather book as well, Road to Nowhere, and I think I'm missing one there. Am I?
I did Ricky Hatton's book with him, War and Peace.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, and I'm looking forward to the Machiasad Muhammad book as well. So thanks very much for your time, Tris.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, mate.
Thank you, mate. Thanks.